Gosh, that was a lot nicer than I expected. So John Whitmer has an old tradition of introductions being roasts, and that one was pretty nice. But I've known Bill since he was a student at Graceland. I had just graduated, but I was back up every year, and every week practically, the first year anyway. And we were in the same social club, and we got to know each other very well. And he was also a runner like me, and so track, we got involved in some things in track. I'm going to get a little drink of water here before we get started. 51 years ago today, no, I'm sorry, 51 years ago this month, 41 people gathered at the home of young church historian Richard Howard to organize a historical society. We were tired of the church putting out nothing but faithful history where the big guys always did everything right and so forth, and there's no critical examination whatsoever. And so my motion to name the new organization the John C. Bennett Historical Society died for lack of a second. So then we finally chose John Whitmer for two reasons. Number one, John Whitmer was the first church historian. Now, we didn't care about the fact that Joseph Smith didn't like his history. That's usually the case anyway. The president of the church is not going to like what you wrote. And secondly, after the martyrdom, John Whitmer was not associated with either the Utah Mormons or the Reorganites. And whoops, there's so much for the water. So there was that neutrality there. I'm the only founder who's here this week. 10 founders are in celestial glory, and they refuse to attend because the weather is so bad here, and it's perfect there that they're staying where they're at. Grant McMurray is one of the 4 survivors, but he's had Parkinson's for 19 years. Pat Spillman has had Parkinson's for quite a long time, and I'm not sure the time. I think Dick Howard is reasonably healthy at 92 or 93, but his wife Barbara needs constant care, so he doesn't really make trips. So I'm the only founder here, and I owe a lot to my good wife Lois for all the help she does. She's need to get safely and hopefully safely back home. As a child, I was a clueless kid. My interests were sports. I don't think I ever listened to, I'm sure I never listened to a single sermon all the way through. Usually by the time we got to the 5th or 10th minute, my mind would have drifted off to the Detroit Tigers or Jackie Robinson or Jack Kramer, the Detroit Lions or whatever. I did know, though, that we were the true church. Now, I didn't know what the heck that meant, except I knew that you are wrong. So I also Latter-day Saints. We had a ladder to heaven. And so righteous saints could climb that ladder and get to heaven after they died. I don't know how they do if they got Parkinson's or anything like that, but at any rate, my soul. And when I was 11, we were sent to Flint, a town of 200,000 people. Now we came from St. Joseph, Missouri, and in Missouri they had de jure racial segregation by law. Flint, like so many cities of the North, had de facto racial segregation in the public schools. They set up the bus lines so it was very easy to get to Central High School, where all the elites went to school, and where all the parents who didn't want their kids to go to school with black kids could send them to Central. The Central High School had 3,500 students. Northern had about half that, and about 1,800 students, about 1/3 of whom were black, and that's why we won all the blacks on our team, and including one future All-American. And so the 1/3 of the, and then the other 2/3 were whites who were just working class whites who worked in the Ford General Motors factories. My 2 older brothers at Northern, where we first lived, is this better? Everything fine? Okay, good. Well, you just got the clueless kid part. Northern had only about 1,800 students, 1/3 of whom were black, and the others were white folks with working class backgrounds. But my 2 older brothers had gone to Northern, and I was very loyal to Northern. And so even though I'd signed up for Central because all my buddies at Longfellow Junior High were in the 9th grade, that was still junior high, we're going to go to Central, I signed up for Central. I soon had regrets. What a stupid thing I had done. And so early in the summer, my dad took me down to the school board office. And he said, my son here would like to change his high school registration. She said, it's too late for that. And I am eternally grateful to my father for not just walking out. He said, he wanted to change to Northern. Oh, you can always change to Northern. So I was able to change to Northern. Well, Northern had 12 state championships in football. Whoops. That's not important. Well, maybe it was. Northern had 12 state championships in football in 26 years of our history. But I decided that my 150-pound frame was not going to be too important at Flint Northern. So I went out for cross country. Well, thanks a lot. High schools in Michigan were 3 years, so I was a sophomore. Pretty soon I was on the varsity, and we had this meet against Midland, which is a really good team. And at the halfway point, the 5th, 6th, and 7th runners of the Northern team were running dead last, and I was one of them, 12th, 13th, and 14th. But we had a 1-mile loop, and then we had a 2nd-mile loop, and it was a 2-mile course. As we came by the end of the 1-mile loop, we're coming by the coaches and the junior varsity people, and Coach Badar yells, "Russell, move up!" Oh, Coach wants me to move up, so I guess I'll move up. So I moved to 11th and 10th and 9th and 8th and 7th. And I was in 6th place when we were pretty much out of sight on the loop, and most of that loop. And finally we're coming into sight, and I was 6th place. And the junior varsity guys from Northern are wondering, who is that white kid coming in here with the Northern jersey on? Oh, it's got to be Bill Russell. It's not Paul Ballinger. It's not Larry Poole. That's the only other guy. So anyway, I got a varsity letter for coming in 5th, and I was told that I was the first person ever to get a varsity letter at Northern my first year. But I doubt that, because I know from long experience now that cross country and track coach records are usually kept in a very sloppy manner. So I doubt it. But anyway, Coach Badar's hollering at me taught me a very good lesson later as a professor. If you give somebody the notion that you have confidence in them, it can do wonders for them. And so, although I had 3 track coaches, including the coach who coached Bruce Jenner to the Olympics championship, Norbert Badar was the best coach I ever had. And so anyway, I ran track in the spring, and in my senior year, I qualified for the state meet in the mile run. The Flint Journal on Sunday listed the names of the 15 Northern guys that had gone to the state. I was the only white guy of the 15. The varsity was about 85% black. Well, in the lunch counter on Monday, a white friend told me, "Do you know that you're the only one?" Well, it took me about half a second to figure out what he was saying. And so I said, these guys have been my teammates and friends for 2 or 3 years. You think I am scared to ride with them to Ann Arbor for the state meet? You've got to be crazy. I didn't say that, but anyway. Also, that same year, my parents bought a television set. That might sound kind of strange now, but I think the reality is that an awful lot of families, maybe a majority, had their first television set in the 1950s. And so this was my good fortune because that was the year of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And so Martin Luther King's message of nonviolent resistance to evil and love your enemies was new to me. It wasn't in our epitome of faith, our faith statement, nor is it in the Articles of Faith, which the LDS use, which is almost identical. No wonder most people thought we were Mormons. Tom Harkin, our congressman and senator for a long time, he first came to Graceland, he started talking about how great Mormons are, and I had to get him aside and say, Tom, we're not Mormons. We don't even like them. This was 19. I mean, that was true back then. I changed my attitude toward Mormons. But anyway, so there I went. So then I went to the church college, Graceland. I began as a physical education major, of course, but I took a religion course every semester. In my freshman year, I took our church history course taught by Roy Cheville, the only church member with a PhD, and that was from the University of Chicago. But the book we used was Strictly Faithful History, written in 1934. We were just moving from a 2-year college to a 4-year college, with our only BA being in religion. So Harold Condit, a dean of students, said to me, Bill, why don't you take a look at the 4-year college, a 4-year program? So I went to my room and looked up the catalog and looked at those courses, and I thought, man, those courses look really interesting. In my junior year, I took the most important course of them all, a 2-semester course in the history of Christianity. Maybe you can figure out why. That would be the most important one. It covered the earliest years of Christianity all the way down through into the 20th century. And we used a text by the great Willis and Walker. This course was important because in our church, we ignored about 13 centuries of the Christian history because those were the dark ages. Nothing important happened then, like, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Francis of Assisi, all kinds of women who were great in their women's nunneries or whatever they called them then. And John Wesley and Calvin, et cetera, et cetera. So I was really fascinated by Willis and Walker's book. I don't remember if I paid much attention to what Cheville was saying, but I was really interested in Willis and Walker. My senior year, I took a course in Christian ethics from Leonard Arrington, who had taken courses from Reinhold Niebuhr at Union Seminary in New York. Niebuhr was thought by many to be the greatest theologian of the 20th century. It seemed that Niebuhr was always focusing on love and justice. And I liked the fact that many political thinkers, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and many others, liked to read Niebuhr frequently. Barack Obama was strongly a fan of Reinhold Niebuhr. I remember him saying one day, I love Niebuhr. And of course, he loved Dr. King. In my senior year, I took Dr. Cheville's theology course. Our first paper was to be on our understanding of God. Easy subject, of course. I went to the library and found some writings of Karl Barth to be very interesting. He was regarded as the founder of Neo-Orthodox theology, which in the minds of the 20th century, well, in the middle of the 20th century, had replaced the liberal or modernist theology which Dr. Cheville had learned at Chicago. I was very pleased with my paper on God, based heavily on Karl Barth, but I got a C+. I didn't realize that Cheville did not like Karl Barth. Cheville liked to hear what he said repeated back to him, regurgitated. And so when our last paper was due, it was to be our own theology. What do you believe by God and Christ and all these things, you know? And I was very busy in finals with other classes and so forth, papers. And so a friend of mine named Roy Muir, who had a key to the pizza parlor back then, Pizza Shack now, we spent the whole night there at the Pizza Shack because he had a key. And I wrote my paper, and I just regurgitated back Cheville's theology. But I threw in a lot of my own illustrations to illustrate what great ideas these were that Cheville had. Well, I got an A. Cheville was so pleased with my paper, he praised me to the class in our last meeting. And but I still thought my paper on God was a heck of a lot better. But anyway, in fact, that's one thing I often told students. Don't worry so much about grades. Worry about whether or not you are learning. That's what you're here for. I was lucky. I got a job. You know, you had no hope that BA in religion at Graceland would get you a job. But I got a job right out of Graceland as an editor at the church's publishing house. And I would be the editor of the youth magazine Stride, which Carl Mesley was very involved in, not as the editor, but as a very, very valuable source. And and then I was also the assistant editor of the Saints Herald, so I would write editorials in the Herald. I wrote 50 editorials in the Herald during my 6 years at Herald House in 1960 to 66. I wanted the message that we presented to our readers to be relevant to the world they live in. My first major editorial in the Herald was on capital punishment. I had written an essay in high school. Miss Rhodes was a great English teacher. And I wrote an essay in her class on capital punishment. My thesis was simple. Kill them. They deserve it. And it's cheaper. It ain't cheaper. But anyway, I will forever be grateful to Miss Rhodes for taking a lot of time to put all kinds of comments on my paper. I read those, because I had high respect for her. Oh my God, I wrote a terribly stupid paper, which I had. And so 60 years later, I wrote an editorial on capital punishment for the Herald. And I gave 10 reasons for opposing state-sponsored killing. I think today I would give pretty much the same 10 points. 1 year later, I wrote an article in Stride opposing the death penalty. 38 years later, I sponsored a resolution at the World Conference in 2000 on the death penalty, and it passed by a margin of 2-1. I suspect a poll in the United States at that time would find about 2-1 in favor of the death penalty, but our World Conference was 2-1 against it. I was so thrilled by the result. But civil rights became the major issue that I wrote about in the Herald and in Stride during my 6 years there. The editorials which got me the most flack from our readers were my editorials on the demonstrations in Birmingham in '63 and Selma in 1965. People would write in to Paul Wellington, who is now the managing editor, and say this article by Russell, should never have been printed and so forth. Paul would come back, we'd get the letter, and they'd send the letter to Paul, and Paul would show it to me, and he'd say, "Don't worry about it, just keep going." I mean, Paul Wellington was a very quiet guy. His name is not known by very many people, but he never edited a single thing I ever wrote. He printed everything I submitted. He was wonderful to me, and so naturally, I think he's fantastic. But we also published in the Herald, I recommended to Paul, Religious News Service is letting us have a copy of Martin Luther King's Oslo speech when he got the Nobel Prize, and a picture of him giving the speech. And we can get the picture and the speech free from Religious News Service because we subscribe. Paul said, great, and so we ran it. We got the worst racist letter ever. Most of the letters were from the Deep South, almost all of them. But the worst one we ever got was from Columbus, Ohio, and it was not did not give his name, and it looked like an old man scribbling. But anyway, and he used the N-word twice, which I won't repeat. But then he said, "King is a fancy skunk, and someone is going to shoot him one of these days." Well, he was right on that. Well, in my first year at Herald House, 1960-61, I was often on campus. I think I might have said that. I was often on campus at Graceland for the Sunday service. And one day the speaker was a fellow by the name of Paul Edwards, who some of you have heard of him. And so I thought his sermon was great. And the sermon was on the question, is there a God? So I said to Paul afterward, could you possibly submit that for use in Stride magazine, our youth magazine? He said, sure. We set a date. Well, then he was about 3 days late getting it in. And Paul, I found out later, Paul was great on deadlines, so he really did feel bad about being 3 days late. But Paul said, sorry to be late, but it took me a long time to figure out if there was one or not. That was typical Paul Edwards humor. Well, then in early 1995, I got a call from Paul Edwards, and I was still at Herald House, and he was at Graceland. And he said, he wondered if I would be interested in a book review of a new book out by a guy named Bob Flanders on Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi. I said, certainly. I said, I'm the book review editor. I would love to have it, and please get it in as soon as you can, because I figured there would probably be a backlash. And so Paul got it in very quickly, and I sent it on to Paul Wellington, and he was running it. Well, then the first presidency called Paul Wellington, my managing editor and my boss, and they would meet together 2 or 3 times a year for lunch and talk about publication issues. And so F. Henry Edwards was the first one to speak at the lunch, and that's Paul's dad. He said, many people said that he ran the church because President W. Wallace Smith was kind of clueless. Don't get too mad at me for that. So F. Henry Edwards said, and he really did run the church, I'm confident of that, and I think Carl Messley would probably agree with that. Bob Flanders, he says, Bob Flanders' book on Nauvoo has just come out, and we should talk about whether or not we should do anything about it. Like, should we review it in the Herald? And so Paul Wellington says, well, your son Paul has a review of Flanders running in the press right now. And so it seemed like their lunch was a little shorter than usual. In 1963, I wrote a letter in the local newspaper, the Independence Examiner, endorsing interracial marriage. 5 years later, the Supreme Court agreed with me, and not that that wasn't my case, but anyway, agreed that interracial marriage is unconstitutional. But some church members were very unhappy with me. One person told Paul Wellington, Bill Russell has ruined his ministry forever. But I have preached about 200 times since then, so it's not entirely true. One day, my friend and stake president, Wayne Updike, father of Tom Rain, brother Bill here, father of Tom's wife, Vicki, Wayne called and asked if I would be interested in going to a local Baptist church to hear a speaker named Kenneth Goff. I recognized Goff as perhaps the greatest anti-Semitic bigot in the country. I kept track of these guys. And I said, sure, I'd love to go hear him. And it was shortly after the Watts riots, so he gave an entirely racist speech, and it was the worst racist speech I had ever heard, and I had heard a lot of them. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. So what should I do? Well, of course, I got up and wrote a letter to the Independence Examiner. What else would I do? It's 4 pages. They used it to my surprise and delight. The Examiner published at least a half a dozen letters setting me straight. I often needed to be set straight, but anyway, as it happened, Herald House was about to have a 3-day open house, 13 hours a day, 8 to 9 p.m. There was a man named Wayne Morse in Kansas City, not the liberal Wayne Morris from Oregon, the senator from Oregon, but a first-class racist in Kansas City who had picketed about everybody in the Kansas City area who was to the left of Barry Goldwater. He spent all 19 hours at our open house out in front with his sign. He always had professional-looking signs. And his sign said, the communists just love William D. Russell. Well, who doesn't want to be loved? I mean, for crying, I felt pretty good about that. So then he showed up for our world conference about 5 months later and had the same sign. And I was still loved. I was thrilled. And so anyway, that was quite an experience. An Independence black woman, about a generation older than me, called me when she got back from the March on Washington in '63. Mrs. Virginia Jacobs wondered if I would be interested in helping her organize a local chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. I said, sure. And it was my job to get white folks to come to meetings and her job to work the black community. We soon learned that black folks aren't interested in going to a meeting, this is in Independence anyway, to a meeting in like in the Stone Church where we scheduled one of our first meetings. So after that, we just met in black people's homes or occasionally in a black church. As we met in black homes in town, I learned that virtually all of the streets in Zion, Independence, Missouri, owned by blacks, were paved with dirt. They were dirt roads and not paved streets. The heart of Zion. Mrs. Jacobs' home was right across the street from the Truman Library on a dirt road. One day I got a call from George Laurent, the director of the Kansas City Council on Religion and Race. It was a consortium of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish clergy. There were only 2 Protestant churches that were not involved, the Southern Baptist and the RLDS. Very embarrassing. George wanted me to attend their meetings and work to try to get the RLDS church involved in our consortium. I contacted all 4 stake presidents in the Kansas City area, and they weren't interested. I was embarrassed again. So I got a friend, Forrest Swall, a social worker and a longtime friend, to go to stake conference with me and second a motion that I would bring to the Santa Fe State Conference, asking our members to participate in our program to get as many people in the Kansas City area to sign a pledge as possible. The pledge not to discriminate on the basis of race if you sold your house. I was shocked when my resolution was beaten by about a 2-to-1 vote. Embarrassed again. A pastor came to me right after the meeting. There were about 20 pastors, about 20 congregations in the state. After listening, and he was livid. After listening to his racist harangue for an incredible long time, I suggested, why don't you come by, you drive by my office every day on the way home from work. Why don't you just come by Harold House, come on in and we'll talk. I thought maybe if you could give him a day and he'll cool off a little bit. He said, okay, and if that doesn't work, I'm prepared to test you physically. Wow, I hadn't had that kind of response before. As a disciple of Dr. King with all that love stuff, what am I going to do? I'm obviously not going to be able to accept a threat like that. There might have been a time earlier in my life I would have been happy to take him on. But anyway, he didn't come by the office. I didn't see him for years. And when I did finally see him, he never mentioned the situation. But I had a very good friend. I'm just going to call him Rip. His nickname was Rip. Was a religion major, 1 year ahead of me at Graceland. He lived in Independence. We went to the same Southwestern congregation. We talked after church frequently. Just a dear friend. But he had come up probably to thank me for my resolution. But he had to stand behind this bigot who was giving me this harangue. So finally, Rip just turned and walked away. I have never seen him again. Rip never went to church again in our church. and he left Independence pretty soon. And so I think we need to remember that when we are leaders and do stupid things, we drive people away from the church. I've seen many cases of that. On the Saturday that we were going to go door to door, knock on the doors to get people to sign the Good Neighbor Pledge, I was very discouraged at 9 o'clock when we were supposed to start because I only had about 5 people to help. I was really frustrated. But then all of a sudden, a carload of seminary students from the Catholic seminary 90 miles away near Maryville, Missouri, drove up. And now I had plenty of workers. You know, I've loved that seminary ever since. And so the only member of the First Presidency to sign our Good Neighbor Pledge was Junior Counselor Morris Draper. No surprise. The only member of the presiding bishopric to sign the Good Neighbor Pledge was Walter Johnson. No surprise. 4 of the 12 apostles signed the pledge. 33% of our top leadership signed, merely were asked to sign the Good Neighbor Pledge. President Wallace Smith sent, when I sent letters to those who their names wasn't on the list to make sure they got a chance, he sent it back to me and he said, we did get a chance to sign the letter, but of course he didn't sign the letter. He thought I was a communist. Anyway, St. Paul School of Theology was really big in my life. And so after 1 year at Harold House, I began to attend St. Paul School of Theology, a Methodist seminary. I would go part-time, and most of us, would go part-time. And it's a 3-year full-time course, and it takes us about 6 years part-time to finish. But I just began just to take some courses. I didn't expect to go all the way at first. The faculty at St. Paul were terrific. In the first year, I took the year-long Bible course. I really appreciated Old Testament professor Charles Bachman, who said on the very first day, "Don't set your moral values aside when you are reading the Bible. There are plenty of immoral things in the Bible. Condemn them just like you would anything else if you're reading them in some other source." And I really appreciated that. I learned from Bachman that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are really fiction. Why is Adam not mentioned in any of the rest of the Old Testament after those early chapters of Genesis? Because he did not exist, period. But a lot of people think he did and write about him as if he did. Probably my all-time favorite professor was New Testament professor Lindsay Farrago. I took every Bible course from Lindsay and Bachman offered, and there was about 8 or 10 in all. And I learned from Farrago that Jesus didn't establish a church. That was much later. And I learned that the virgin birth of Jesus it's in the birth accounts in Matthew and Luke, but it's nowhere else in the New Testament at all, period. I learned that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I learned that Paul, he had 14 letters that are ascribed to Paul, and Paul's name is on 14 letters in the New Testament, but he only wrote 7 of them. And of the male chauvinist writings of Paul that we often condemn him for, all but one of them are in the writings that he did not write. So I defend Paul as not the chauvinist pig that we often have called him. And then John Swamley was another really important professor for me because he taught Christian social ethics and Christian social concerns. He was a big inspiration. He was my academic advisor too. He was a big inspiration to me as I wrote about Christian social concerns in the Herald and Stride and so forth. Conservative critics often said that if our folks attended St. Paul, we'd all just be indoctrinated in Methodist theology. That is absolutely not true about St. Paul. I don't remember any professor ever assigning a book from the Methodist press or a Methodist author it was strictly ecumenical, and there was never any attempt to push Methodist theology at us. Our first three graduates were Dick Lancaster, my brother-in-law, who probably the reason I went. He so strongly encouraged me. He was valedictorian in the first class of 1965, and he later became president of Simpson College, a Methodist college in Iowa. I was number 2 in the class of 67. Cliff Buck was number 3 in Dick's class. And then we had a host of high church leaders, including Grant McMurray and several apostles, and so I'm not going to go into them, but we had quite a few graduates, and we had quite a few others who just took courses that were interesting to them at St. Paul. After 6 years at Herald House, I was on the Graceland faculty full-time for 41 years, 1966 to 2007, and 10 years part-time after that. I taught American religious history, and politics. The Vietnam War was the big issue on campus when I arrived on the faculty in '66, and I spoke against the war in several of what we called coffee houses, I guess. And then I was on leave from Iowa, from Graceland to go to Iowa for a couple of years in the accelerated law program. And one day, my copy of a dialogue came to me, and I opened it, and there was that great article on civil rights. His name is always slipping me. Lester Bush, I think his name was. And 63 pages long or something like that. I read it carefully. Put all my law books aside. Spent about 3 or 4 hours just reading and thinking about what Lester was writing about. And so the very next issue of Dialogue, I wrote a letter to the editor. I said, we RLDS have often bragged about the fact that we have had a revelation back in 1865 that we could ordain blacks, and that's more than a century ahead of your policy in the Mormon Church. But, this is 1973, neither of our churches ordain women, and that is just as bad. Well, in 1978, I published in Dialogue probably my most important piece on the RLDS Church and Race, a priestly role for a prophetic church. We claim to have a prophet, but we are really a priestly church because we avoid prophetic issues. Well, pretty soon, moving back in time a little bit, but a bunch of us at Herald House, and Paul Edwards and I were probably the main leaders of this, we decided the Saints Herald has gone to the dogs. I mean, it's been sanitized. There's nothing, solid, no solid academic type stuff in the Herald like there used to be. And so we decided to publish a journal. And so there were 7 of us that were on the editorial board. But Paul Edwards and Barbara Higdon and I and Roy Muir and Lauren White were the local folks, and then we got 4 people from off campus. Roger Yarrington, Paul was now in Washington, D.C. We got him on board, and 3 others. So anyway, we got started. We called it Courage, not to be confused with the beer in Scotland. But it only lasted for 3 years, 1970 to 1973. And we published only 11 issues before we went broke. But we endorsed 3 issues that the church was not yet willing to face. Number 1, we endorsed women in the priesthood 13 years before it happened in 1984-85. Secondly, we endorsed open communion 23 years before it was accepted in 1994. And thirdly, my pet peeve for a long time was the lineal descent in the office of church president. With the ordination of Grant McMurray, That tradition came to an end in 1996, 25 years after my editorial against both the RLDS and the LDS methods of succession in the presidency. I said that both methods are absolutely terrible, and I could not make a decision as to which one was the worst because they're both so bad. I really couldn't come to a conclusion. We had many other fine articles in Courage, but I'm going to let it go at that. But one day in 1976, Paul Edwards came to my office and asked, would I like to ride with Paul and his brother Lyman and church historian Dick Howard in a trip to the Mormon History Association meeting in Provo, Utah? Well, although I wasn't much interested in Mormon history, riding with these three characters for 20 hours each way would be a blast. So I said, I'll do it. Professor Jim Allen gave us a tour of BYU, and we were very surprised to find a baptismal fount in a large classroom. We'd never seen that before. I asked him what percent of students at BYU were non-Mormons, were not Mormons. He said about 8% at the beginning of the year, but 7% at the end of the year. So that's for a big university, that's a lot of baptisms. No wonder they had that fount there. I said, well, the last I'd heard, Graceland was 74% RLDS. And then Paul Edwards, in his typical humor, said, and we have 60% at the end of the year. When we went to the meeting of the Mormon History Association, Leonard Arrington, a wonderful fellow. I mean, I can't think of anybody I would praise higher than Leonard Arrington. But when we went to the meeting, Leonard Arrington was so delighted and surprised to see us. His eyes just lit up when he saw the five of us, because Mark McKiernan had joined us. He lived in Idaho. And we were sitting in the very back row. We were naturally kind of shy. And it was just a strange. And he saw us. He came running back. He went through the aisle in front of us and shook everybody's hands and got our names. And then he said, move over. And he climbed over in the middle of us. And then just rattle, talking like crazy. And in fact, one time he told me, I spend half of my reading time on reading your Courage magazine, your Courage journal. But anyway, so the meeting was over, and we had a really good time. Well, then the MHA very nicely decided to come to Independence the next year, but it happened to be on the Saturday just before World Conference finishes. And so some of the, Leonard and a few others came early. Well, the 1972 World Conference was very controversial. They had found out that we were baptizing polygamous men in South India. And so there was huge opposition being expressed. And some of my Mormon friends were saying, I was shocked at the way some of your people spoke to the prophet or to whoever was in whatever member of the First Presidency was in the chair. And so then that night we had a banquet, and Dick Howard led in singing hymns from the early church. And Dick said, well, now let's sing Redeemer of Israel, and let's have the Western saints sing the first and third stanzas, and the Midwestern saints sing the second and the fourth stanza. Okay. And when we finished, he said, well, now, did you notice that the Western saints sang, how long we have wandered as strangers in sin? And and then after the laughter subsided, one of the LDS people said, and cried in the desert for thee. So we had much humor in our meetings from that time on. And thank Dick Howard got it started in the right way, I guess. 4 years later, in 1976, Paul Edwards and I flew to Salt Lake City, and we stayed overnight with Leonard Arrington. And the next morning, knowing that Paul loved his coffee, Leonard pulled out of his top cupboard a small jar of instant coffee and offered it to Paul, and Paul drank it, of course. He hadn't cleared this with his local bishop, but anyway, 3 bus loads then. Paul said it wasn't good coffee, but I really appreciated Leonard's thought and good thinking. thoughtfulness in giving it to me. So 3 buses departed for Salt Lake City, and we had our meeting at St. George. But on the way, we stopped at the Mountain Meadows, and we walked down that path. And so the next day, when I got up to give my paper on James Strang, I said, having been raised an RLDS member in the Midwest, it seemed like the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the kind of thing you can expect from Mormons. But then yesterday, when there was 12 of us and about 200 of you walking down that single file path to the meadows, I was scared. But we got out. We all got out. And so I will go back to the Midwest and tell my Midwest RLDS friends back there that contemporary Mormons are peace-loving people. Well, in 1983, I was the MHA president. My presidential address was on how the study of history has affected my understanding of the 3 standard books of the RLDS Church, the Joseph Smith Revision of the Bible, and then the RLDS editions of the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. My view of the Book of Mormon is that Joseph Smith is the author. I taught the course 5 times at Graceland, and that was good enough for me. In a later article, I compared the view of Jesus in Joseph Smith's canonical writings with the view of Jesus in the 4 Gospels. The Jesus in the Book of Mormon is quite different from the Jesus in the 4 Gospels. The Book of Mormon's Jesus is one who issues commandments to be obeyed. Disobedience can even require your destruction. Repent or be destroyed. That statement in different wording is in the Book of Mormon at least a half a dozen times. But yet Jesus in the 4 Gospels, he reveals the gospel of love, which is personal. And Jesus often disobeyed those commandments, which allegedly can lead to your destruction. In the Book of Mormon, Americans are God's chosen people. I don't think we have anything quite like that in the Book of Mormon. In some of the countries where our church exists, they don't even use the Book of Mormon because it's an American book with Americans as the chosen people. Sorry, we're not interested, many of our international members say. For me, the most terrible passage in the Book of Mormon is very early, about page 14 or so. Quote, "Behold, the Lord slayeth the wicked to bring forth his righteous purposes. It is better that one man perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief." That is a great justification for the Inquisition and for capital punishment. My daughter, when she was about 11, my youngest daughter, a lawyer now, she said to me one day, "Dad, I'd kind of like to read that Book of Mormon thing." I said, "Okay, here's a copy of it." And about 2 or 3 days later, she handed it back to me. She got about to page 14. She got about to this passage, and that was enough for her. She didn't read me on that. And I really don't blame her. I mean, why would she be attracted to statements like that? I listened to about 50 audio tapes of our only RLDS cult leader, our only RLDS cult murderer, Jeff Lundgren. He often used what I call these terrible passages, such as one I quoted in the Book of Mormon. And I've listened to 50 of his tapes. And if I was a member of his congregation, I would have only gone to his class once, and they would never seen me again. But I listened to all these tapes because I was writing a book. But the 4 Gospels portray Jesus as nonviolent, in quite a contrast to the Book of Mormon. Jesus has normally been seen as a pacifist, as was the Christian church for the first 3 centuries. So I see a tremendous difference between the Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon and the Jesus in the Book of Mormon and the Jesus in the 4 Gospels. The Book of Mormon contains a single early 19th century American understanding of a farm boy from New York. The four Gospels are first century portrayals of Jesus by four writers who were early disciples of the faith that Jesus proclaimed. And they are the earliest portrayals we have. For me, as a historian, it's a no-brainer. Which of those two kind of interpretations you're going to take? One elderly LDS woman came up to me after my MHA address, and she thanked me, and she said, "That was just what I've been thinking for a long time, and I'm happy to hear somebody finally said it." Well, Lou Midgley from BYU was sitting with Grant McMurray at the last table, and Grant said Lou was clearly not pleased. Well, it took Lou only 26 pages, single-spaced, the letter that he sent to me, to begin explaining to me the errors of my address. I waited about a month, which is the way I handle people like this. I waited about a month, and I sent him a 2-page response. Well, then he sent me probably at least 3 more letters that averaged at least 26 pages, single space. My errors were voluminous. But anyway, after my 1963 presidential address, and then Melvin Smith's previous address the year before on faithful history, some Orthodox Mormons of the MHA had had enough. So the next year, the MHA went to BYU, and they sanitized the program. By that, I mean there were 4 bright, young, liberal Mormon scholars who've been presenting papers at the conferences before. And one of these bright young men was awarded the best paper for the previous year, but his proposal and the 3 other young men were all denied. So I called the new MHA president. I'm the president, past president. I called the new president, and complained. And he said, "Well, we've accepted all the RLDS papers proposed." I said, "I'm not driving 1,000 miles to BYU to hear Alma Blair or Dick Howard or Paul Edwards speak. I can hear them often here at home. I'm driving out there with Bob Mesley and Alma Blair to hear young scholars like these 4 that you've dismissed." And so, anyway, in the midst of my anger at the sanitized 1984 MHA, a still small voice came to me and said, "Sunstone's where the action is really at." So later that summer, I went to Sunstone, and I was amazed. I mean, there was a very, very significant feminist, I'll call it a feminist caucus there, and a very, very significant gay rights caucus there. And I just loved every minute of it. And I went to Sunstone most years for the next 30 years. And so I invited several apostles to come, and some other apostles came, despite without my invitation. But anyway, at least 7 apostles came to Sunstone at different times in the next few years. And 2 of them were women. And the first one that came was Susan Staker. And she said, Susan Score, I'm sorry. Sorry, Susan. Susan Score. And she said, "I'm just going to try to stay beneath the surface and just kind of see how things are going." I said, "You won't. You will be mobbed." Because a woman apostle at a Mormon meeting is fantastic. And she was mobbed. And then a few years later, Robin Linkhart, who pretty soon became an apostle. When both of these people I had known pretty well, and both of them I said, you represent a lot of the West. You need to go to Sunstone. And so I said that to Robin. Robin is a very dear friend. Her son was a student assistant of mine for a couple of years. And so I said, "You've got to go to Sunstone." She went to Sunstone, had tremendous success, was mobbed, of course, and now she's a member of the board of directors of Sunstone. And one time, they had a real difficult problem with an old veteran of Sunstone who had said a very stupid thing to a Latin American employee at the University of Utah where we were meeting. and they were going to kick him out. Utah was going to kick him out, and he had several papers still to give. And the young leader of Sunstone said, "Oh, gosh, I don't know how to handle him." She said, "Robin, could you go talk to him?" So Robin went and talked to the guy who had been a naughty boy, and talked to him. And if you'd just go apologize to this young man, I suspect Utah will let you stay here. And he did, and he got to stay. But anyway, the Sunstone experience was wonderful. Well, then we'll raise another topic, and I'm getting pretty near the end. The 1984 World Conference was when we ordained women to the priesthood, approved it. But at that same conference, gay and lesbian people in the church and their supporters began to quietly meet in the evening at Arthur Butler's house in Independence and plan the organization of some kind of meeting, which became GALA, Gay and Lesbian Acceptance. In the years that followed, they interviewed various general authorities of the church, and they found quite a bit of support. So they began holding retreats, and often at church-owned campgrounds and so forth. Graceland students soon organized what I think they called the Gay-Straight Alliance. And some of the things that Bob Mesley did, I think really kind of helped start that organization, and I got involved in it a little bit later. When Lois and I entered the hotel room that morning at Gala, we got invited to Gala in Chicago, and by a couple of the members. And I went into that room in Chicago. I met about 5 of the best students I had ever had, who were among the nicest people I had ever known. And so, how could I not give full support to this movement from that day forward? When the annual International Gala Retreat was held at Camp Donovan, north of Kansas City, on Labor Day in 1999, Everett Graffio, the presiding evangelist by this time, we couldn't call our women that were ordained to this office patriarchs anymore, so we had to call on all evangelists. And we had evangelist blessings, not patriarchal blessings. So anyway, Graffio was there, and at one point Graffio held a class, and he said at the outset that he had come to learn. He'd just come to learn because he had a lot to learn. But someone asked him whether he supported the idea of evangelists giving evangelist blessings to gay or lesbian couples. We gave evangelist blessings to married couples. What about gay couples? Everett stood there and thought it through out loud. Took a while to think it through. And then finally he said, "So yes, I could bless a couple of the same sex if they were good people." I don't think there was a dry eye in the class, certainly not mine. At the closing worship service, Graffio gave an evangelist blessing to the whole Gala group present. The Gala organization asked me to publish a book of stories by GLBT people and their supporters. So I did. In fact, it was one of the books. It was one of the books on display. In this, so I published my book, Homosexual Saints, A Community of Christ Experience. 2008, John Weber Books. With a preface by Michael Quinn, and it was edited by Lavina Fielding Adderson, 2 longtime cherished friends. It irritates me every time I think of it that these 2 wonderful people were excommunicated. And I mean excommunicated. Anyway, and Lavina, after 25 years, she continued to go to church regularly, played the piano. She asked to have it lifted. They said, "No, you're still." It's just Lavina is one of the finest people I've ever known, as is Michael. Anyway, to conclude, I'm an ecumenical Christian. My classes, readings, and personal experiences led me to a theology of social justice. Major writers who influenced me include Roy Cheville, Lindsay Farrago, John Swamley, Reinhold Niebuhr, his brother Richard, Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Mary Daly, and John Shelby Spong. Now, it worries me that these people are now dead. And I haven't been feeling that well lately myself either. The Community of Christ mission statement since 1964 is just fine with me. It says, we proclaim Jesus Christ and promote communities of hope, joy, love, and peace. We focus on Jesus and not Joseph Smith, and we promote Christian communities, much like the original Latter-day Saint focus on building communities, which they called Zion. And finally, I think I'd like to mention Paul Tillich. His statement is very helpful when he said, all religious affirmations are fallible, period. And that goes for affirmations for the people of the highest authority in the church or whatever. So now is the time for questions or tomatoes or whatever you prefer. And I think I'll sit down.
Is this mic on? Yeah. What I'm going to do, since Bill can't see you, is come around. So who has questions? I can't see. Yes.
Looks like Daniel.
Testing. There we go. Thanks, Bill, for your remarks. This is Mike Nilsson, if you can't see me.
Oh, I'm sorry, I called you Daniel, but you're Michael, yeah. Neil,
Yep.
I remember the last name Nielsen because that's just a familiar name to me.
Oh, good, good. No tomatoes thrown at you here, but what is the positive, good, and lasting and continued relevance of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon to Community of Christ today?
I've always said that, and I think I haven't changed my view, that I support the idea of the Book of Mormon being part of our scriptures, because there are lots of people who read the Book of Mormon and are converted, or at least feel they have felt the presence of Christ, or feel that it's a book that was really big in their life. It's not in mine. I've read it 5 times and did not get a whole lot out of it. So I think it deserves its place in the canon of Scripture, because it is the book which really kind of founded the church. I mean, so many of those early saints like Sidney Rigdon and others joined the church because they found the Book of Mormon so meaningful to them. And I know RLDS people today who still, they may not have joined because of the RLDS church, maybe they were raised in the church, but they find the Book of Mormon very meaningful to them today. So just like a lot of books in the Bible might be helpful to you but not to me, or vice versa, I think the Book of Mormon is relevant to a decent number of people in the church. And as long as that's true, I'm all right with it being in. Just don't try to make me proclaim that it is literal history, because it's not. I mean, where the heck did this history happen? There's no way we have any idea where this supposed history happened. But anyway, that's another question. So anyway, that's a good question. And the book, Joseph Smith is not as relevant as he used to be. That's clearly the case. We had a delightful black woman from Mississippi came to Lamoni, and I don't know what brought her to Lamoni. But anyway, she came to our church regularly. And she would get up during the question and comment period before the service started, and she'd tell us about some of her the most recent experiences and so forth. Pretty soon she decided to get baptized, so she got baptized. Well, she hadn't come to the adult Sunday school classes before, but now that she's baptized, she decided to come to the adult Sunday school classes. So I was there one day, and she was at the class, and there got to be talk about early Latter-day Saint history. Pretty soon she says, "Well, now, who is this Joseph Smith?" She just joined the church. Who is this Joseph Smith? So I think that illustrates he's not as important, but we do make some use of him, and we do honor those who find the Book of Mormon and other things that Joseph Smith did valuable.
Other questions? Yes.
So talk.
Hi, Glenn.
Yes, thank you for remembering my name. You were on sort of the left side of the church. Maybe I'm making a judgment, but did
Sort of. Okay. Yeah.
did you move in the priesthood circles? Were you an elder or high priest or bishop? Did you work in the track of the priesthood?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can you talk to us about maybe some of your spiritual feelings about, the restoration movement?
Yeah, okay. I was ordained a priest when I was a sophomore at Graceland. I was still fairly Orthodox at that time. But then I got to work at Herald House, and actually my pastor at the Liberty congregation really liked my sermons. I threw in a lot of social justice, and especially racism. And even though he became a restorationist later, he really appreciated me. And when I moved into South Chrysler in Independence, he would have me back once a year or so to preach again, because he wanted to hear some more of my social justice. But anyway, then I became, but I'm still a priest. Now, my brother-in-law, Dick Lancaster, thought that they kept me a priest instead of, typically a guy like me would have been moved up to elder. But, I gave the First Presidency a hard time with my editorials. And Dick, anyway, my brother-in-law, thinks that F. Henry Edwards probably said, well, let's leave this guy a priest. Because one of his letters, he said, well, now, Bill Russell, he's a priest, but he, whatever. So anyway, I remained a priest for a long time, about almost 50 years. And then, of course, the first Wallace Smith thought I was a communist. My pastor at South Chrysler turned out thought I was a communist. I think they're all reading J. Edgar Hoover or the John Birch Society and that junk. But then finally, when I was just about to turn 60, I was ordained an elder. And I think I was only ordained an elder because my wife was new to the congregation, and they knew that she was very valuable, and they wanted her to be an elder, but they didn't want to ordain her past her husband, so they ordained me an elder first, and then they ordained Lois an elder later. But anyway, I would not, if I was offered, and I might insult some people here now, but if I was offered the office of high priest, I would say no. Jeff Spencer, when he was an apostle, and he retired from the 12, and they said, well, okay, we'll just make you a high priest. And Jeff said, no thanks, I would rather be an elder, because apostle has absolutely no New Testament support. And I'll just tell you a quick story at St. Paul. One day, I'm with Paul Jones and Dale Dunlap. We're the first in line for lunch at St. Paul. And Paul Jones is new, but he was a really outspoken guy. But anyway, Dale Dunlap had been asked by Garland Tickemeyer to speak to the high priest quorum the next night, Saturday night, at the Laurel Club in Independence. So Dale Dunlap says to me, oh, Bill, how do I get to the auditorium? So it's a very, very easy explanation. But Paul Jones turned the other way because this wasn't his conversation. So then Dale said, well, now what group will I be speaking to? And I said, the high priest. And Jones, well, the high priest, oops, sorry. And so I guess this is good. Anyway, There's not too many high priests in this world outside the Latter-day Saint tradition, because it's not in. There are several of our priesthood offices that aren't in the New Testament as Christian offices. High priest is one of them. But anyway, that's my priesthood lineage, and I'm satisfied with that. I would have been satisfied to stay a priest forever.
Bill?
Yeah.
It is time to go. We have to get to our tours and so forth. And I just want to thank Bill, and let's give him a big hand of applause.